You married your sister.
The mahogany doors of the master bedroom at Thornfield Park burst open with such force that the portraits of long-dead ancestors seemed to shudder against the crimson wallpaper. Lady Isabella Blackwood, 28 years old, stood frozen in the doorway. Her powder-blue gown, a stark contrast to the blood-red walls, while her husband, Lord Jonathan Blackwood, knelt beside his dying father's canopied bed. The old Baron, Charles Blackwood, 73 years of consumption and guilt, was drowning. In his own tubercular blood, his skeletal hand gripping Jonathan's with terrifying strength as he gasped out the words that would annihilate two of England's most illustrious families. His voice, wet and rattling, cut through the heavy air like a blade through silk, and what he confessed in those final moments would prove that some secrets, once buried, grow more monstrous in the dark. "Forgive me, my son," the Baron choked, blood flecking his grey lips. "Isabella is not Lord Ashford's daughter. She is mine. You married your sister." The silver tray bearing the laudanum bottle slipped from the hands of Mrs. Agnes Hartwell, the housekeeper who had served the Blackwoods for 40 years, shattering against the floor in an explosion of glass and metal that seemed to mark the exact moment their world ended. Jonathan's face transformed from confusion to comprehension, to a horror so profound that he released his father's hand as though it had burst into flames. He turned, slowly, mechanically, to look at Isabella, his wife of 3 years, mother of his 2 infant daughters, and in his eyes she saw something die. Not love. Love could be killed. This was the death of reality itself. Isabella's hand pressed against her mouth, but no sound emerged. Her mind, trained in literature and philosophy and all the useless ornaments of aristocratic feminine education, raced through implications like a mathematical proof of damnation. Every kiss, every tender word whispered in darkness, every night of marital intimacy, every moment of joy with Charlotte and Eleanor, all of it retroactively transformed into abomination. The room tilted. The Baron's death rattle filled her ears like the tolling of a funeral bell, and Mrs. Hartwell, recovering from her shock, began to scream for the physician, her voice carrying down the corridors of Thornfield Park like a plague announcement, ensuring that within hours every servant in the manor would know, and within days every drawing-room in 3. Counties would whisper the most delicious scandal Victorian England had ever consumed. But before we continue with this tale of blood and secrets, of innocence destroyed and desperate choices made in the shadows of a dying empire, we invite you to let us know. Where in the world are you watching from? Comment your country or city below. We love connecting with viewers from across the globe who share our fascination with history's darkest moments. For what happened next at Thornfield Park would test not only the limits of human endurance, but the very foundations upon which Victorian morality claimed to stand. The Baron died 17 minutes later, his confession complete, his burden transferred. Dr. Edmund Thorne arrived too late to do anything but pronounce the time of death and sign the certificate, his experienced eyes noting the peculiar tableau before him. Jonathan Blackwood, standing at the window with his back to the room, rigid as a marble statue. Isabella collapsed in a corner chair, her face bloodless, her hands trembling in her lap, and Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, hovering near the door with an expression that the good doctor recognized immediately, the look of someone who had just acquired devastating power and was calculating exactly how to wield it. He had served the country gentry long enough to know that death often revealed more than it concealed, and whatever had transpired in this room before his arrival, it was not simply the passing of an elderly aristocrat. Jonathan did not speak to Isabella that night, or the next day, or the day following, he locked himself in the library with his father's brandy and his father's sins, refusing to see his wife, refusing to acknowledge his daughters, those beautiful doomed girls who carried incestuous blood in their veins through no fault of their own. The servants whispered. The footmen exchanged significant glances. The maids clustered in the scullery, their voices dropping to scandalized murmurs. Whenever Isabella passed, she could feel the knowledge spreading through Thornfield Park like rot through timber, invisible but inexorable, weakening every foundation she had ever trusted. Isabella had been raised as the beloved daughter of Viscount Henry Ashford and his wife Margaret. Her childhood at Ashford Hall in Warwickshire had been one of privilege and tenderness, music lessons and watercolour painting, French and Italian, riding through autumn forests on her favourite mare. Her mother had died when Isabella was 16, and her father 2 years ago, both taking their secrets to graves in the family crypt. She had never questioned her parentage. Why would she? She had her mother's red hair and her father's, no, not her father's, never her father's, green eyes, or so she had believed. Now, examining her reflection in the dressing table mirror by candlelight, she saw Charles Blackwood's aristocratic nose, his high cheekbones, his long fingers. The evidence had always been there. She had simply never thought to look. The marriage had been celebrated as a triumph. Jonathan Blackwood, Oxford-educated, heir to Thornfield Park and its extensive northern estates, had courted her with genuine affection after they met at a house party in Hampshire in the autumn of 1875. He wrote poetry, he made her laugh. He treated her not as an ornamental wife-to-be, but as an intellectual companion. Their wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral in June of 1876 had been attended by 400 guests. Covered in the Times, blessed by bishops, they had been happy, genuinely, radiantly happy, and that happiness was now revealed as a grotesque joke played by fate and her father's, no, by Baron Blackwood's, cowardice. Charlotte was 2 years old, Eleanor 6 months, both sleeping peacefully in the nursery under the care of their devoted nurse, Miss Pemberton, unaware that their entire futures had just been cremated by a dying man's confession. According to the law, according to the church, according to every social structure that governed Victorian England, these innocent children were now illegitimate. Worse than illegitimate. They were the product of incest. They could never inherit, never marry into decent families, never be presented at court. They would be whispered about, pointed at, shunned, condemned before they learned to read, punished for a sin committed by adults before they were born. Isabella pressed her hands against her abdomen, where she had recently begun to suspect a third child might be growing. The thought made her physically ill. She rushed to the wash basin and vomited until nothing remained but bile and despair. When she finally raised her head, wiping her mouth with a linen towel, she saw Mrs. Hartwell reflected in the mirror, standing in the doorway of the bedroom with her arms crossed and an expression of cold satisfaction on her weathered face. The housekeeper had not knocked, and in that calculated breach of protocol, Isabella understood immediately that the old woman no longer considered her mistress of Thornfield Park. She was simply a curiosity now, a scandal, a woman who had unknowingly committed the unforgivable. "Mrs. Hartwell," Isabella said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt, "you will pack your belongings and leave Thornfield Park by morning. I will provide you with 6 months' wages and a reference letter for household management. Nothing more." The housekeeper's thin lips curled into something that might have been a smile on a kinder face. "Will you now, your ladyship? And what makes you think I'll be wanting a reference from a woman who married her own brother? What makes you think you have any authority left in this house at all?" The words hung in the air between them like drawn daggers. Isabella had been raised to be gentle, to defer, to embody all the soft virtues Victorian society demanded of its ladies. But she had also been raised by Margaret Ashford, who had taught her daughter, in whispered conversations during long afternoon walks, that survival sometimes required a woman to become what society claimed she could not be: ruthless. "You will leave," Isabella repeated, moving toward the housekeeper with deliberate steps. "Because if you do not, I will ensure that every household in England knows you as a thief. The missing silver spoons last Christmas, the bottles of French wine that disappeared from the cellar, the household accounts that never quite balanced." Mrs. Hartwell's face flushed. "You have no proof of such lies." Isabella smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I have 40 years of household ledgers, Mrs. Hartwell. I have been reviewing them quite carefully these past months, as any good mistress should, and I have discovered the most interesting discrepancies. Proof enough for a magistrate, I should think. Enough to see you transported, perhaps, or at the very least imprisoned." It was a bluff, but only partially. Isabella had indeed noticed irregularities, though she had never investigated them seriously until this moment, when they became weapons. The housekeeper's confidence wavered. Transportation to Australia for theft, prison, the workhouse. These were real threats, and they both knew it. "You're bluffing," Mrs. Hartwell said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Test me," Isabella replied softly. "Spread your gossip. Tell your stories. Destroy my reputation and my daughter's futures, and I will destroy yours in return, with the full weight of aristocratic privilege and access to magistrates who dine at this table and owe favors to the Blackwood name. You may take me down, Agnes, but I promise you, I will drag you into hell with me." For a long moment, they stared at each other, two women separated by class and circumstance, but united in their understanding of exactly how much they stood to lose. Mrs. Hartwell left the room without another word. But Isabella knew, with the cold certainty that comes from truly understanding human nature, that the housekeeper would not be silenced so easily. Fear might buy silence for a day, a week perhaps, but resentment would fester. And in a world where servants' gossip traveled faster than telegraph wires, where scandals were currency and ruined aristocrats were entertainment for the masses, Agnes Hartwell held information more valuable than gold. She would use it. The only question was when, and to whom, and how. Catastrophically, Isabella found Jonathan in the library 3 hours past midnight, surrounded by empty brandy bottles and theological texts pulled haphazardly from the shelves. He had torn pages from the family Bible, the record of births and marriages that traced the Blackwood lineage back 200 years, and scattered them across the Persian carpet like the fragments of a shattered world. When she entered, he did not look up. "You knew," he said, his voice hoarse from drink and weeping. "Somehow, you must have known." The accusation was so absurd, so divorced from reality, that Isabella almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she closed the door behind her and leaned against it, gathering what remained of her strength. "I knew nothing," she said. "I am as much a victim of this as you are, Jonathan. More so, perhaps, because I must now watch my children be destroyed for sins they did not commit." He looked up then, and his eyes were those of a stranger, red-rimmed, wild, filled with something that might have been madness or might have been a different kind of clarity. "They are abominations," he whispered. "The Bible is clear. Leviticus chapter 18, verse 9, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister." We have committed what even pagans would condemn. Our children are cursed, Isabella. Cursed. He stood swaying slightly, and she saw that he held his father's dueling pistol in his right hand, though whether he intended to use it on himself, on her, or on their daughters, she could not say. "Put down the gun," Jonathan. Her voice remained calm, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. Our daughters are innocent. Whatever we are, whatever we have unknowingly done, Charlotte and Eleanor bear no guilt. They are children. He laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the leather-bound volumes surrounding them. Innocent? They carry our blood, Isabella. Our poisoned, corrupted blood. Every time I look at Charlotte, I see my sister's face, because she is my sister, and my daughter, and my niece all at once. What kind of monster does that make me? What kind of monsters does that make them? The theological gymnastics of his tortured logic would have been fascinating under other circumstances. Now, they were simply terrifying. It makes you human, Isabella said, moving slowly toward him, her hands visible and empty. It makes you a man who loved a woman without knowing they shared blood. That is tragedy, Jonathan, not sin. We did not choose this. We did not know. But even as she spoke, she wondered if she believed her own words. The Catholic faith of her childhood, her mother's faith inherited through whispered prayers and midnight masses, offered no such easy absolution. The priest to whom she had confessed 2 days ago, Father Michael O'Brien, had been unable to hide his horror. He had stammered through platitudes about God's mercy while his hands shook on his rosary beads. He had not, she noticed, granted her forgiveness. Because how could he? What penance could possibly cleanse incest, even unwitting incest? The marriage must be annulled, Jonathan said, lowering the pistol slightly. I have already written to my solicitor in London. The church will dissolve our union. You will return to Ashford Hall, and the children will be placed in a convent somewhere on the continent, where no one knows our shame. It is the only merciful solution. Merciful. The word was so grotesque in context that Isabella felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart, which had already broken, but something harder and more fundamental. Her illusions, perhaps. Her faith in Jonathan's love, which apparently extended only as far as social acceptability allowed. Or her belief that men, even good men, would protect children over reputation. No, she said simply. Jonathan blinked as though he had misheard. No, he repeated. No, Isabella confirmed, and in her voice was a finality that surprised even herself. I will not allow our daughters to be hidden away, like shameful secrets. I will not allow them to grow up believing they are monsters when they are simply children born into impossible circumstances. And I will not abandon them to nuns who will treat them as cursed creatures rather than human beings deserving of love. She moved closer, close enough now to take the pistol from his unresisting hand, close enough to smell the brandy on his breath and see the broken capillaries in his eyes. If you wish to destroy yourself, Jonathan, I cannot stop you. But you will not destroy Charlotte and Eleanor, not while I draw breath. He stared at her as though seeing her clearly for the first time since his father's confession. You would defy me? You would defy the law of God and man? Isabella set the pistol on the desk, far from his reach, and straightened her spine in a gesture that would have made her mother proud. I would defy hell itself to protect my children, Jonathan. And if that makes me a monster in your eyes, then so be it. But I will not be a monster who abandons her young to satisfy society's appetite for sacrifice. She turned and walked to the door, pausing only to deliver her final words. Sleep off the brandy. In the morning, you will decide whether you are a father or a coward. I already know which I am. The next morning brought cold November rain and colder realities. Mrs. Hartwell had indeed packed her belongings, but she had not left Thornfield Park. Instead, she had taken residence in the servants' quarters, above the stables, claiming that as a 40-year employee, she deserved proper notice and a formal dismissal letter signed by the master of the house. Jonathan, emerging from the library, hollow-eyed and shaking, had neither the will nor the clarity to provide such a letter. The housekeeper remained, a malignant presence in the household, her very existence a daily reminder that the secret was not contained, could never be contained, would eventually metastasize into public knowledge and destroy them all. Dr. Edmund Thorne returned on the third day after the Baron's death, ostensibly to review the medical certificates and ensure all documentation was in order for the funeral. He was a man of 55 years, widowed, with a reputation for discretion that made him the preferred physician of the country gentry when their ailments were more social than medical. He found Isabella in the conservatory, where she sat among the ferns and orchids, staring at nothing, her untouched tea growing, and cold beside her. "Lady Blackwood," he said gently, settling into the chair across from her. "Forgive the intrusion, but I have concerns about your health and about certain things I observed in the Baron's final moments." Isabella studied him carefully. Dr. Thorne had kind eyes, but kind eyes could belong to dangerous men when reputation and moral certainty were at stake. "What did you observe, Doctor?" she asked, her voice neutral. He removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a handkerchief, a gesture she recognized as one he employed when choosing his words carefully. "I observed a family in crisis. I observed a husband who cannot look at his wife. I observed servants who speak in whispers, and a housekeeper who smiles like a cat with a captive mouse. And I observed, most tellingly, the dates in the Baron's private medical journal, which he kept meticulously, and which I was required to review for the death certificate." He replaced his spectacles and met her eyes directly. "The spring of 1850, Ashford Hall. Your mother's name appears frequently in his notes." So he knew, or suspected strongly enough that it amounted to the same thing. Isabella felt the familiar wave of nausea rising, but forced it down through sheer will. "And what do you intend to do with your observations, Dr. Thorne?" The elderly physician leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I intend to help you, Lady Blackwood, if you will permit me." The offer was so unexpected that Isabella could only stare at him in confusion. "Why?" she finally managed. "Why would you help someone like me?" He smiled sadly. "Because I have lived long enough to understand that morality is more complex than the Church would have us believe. Because innocent children should not suffer for the sins of their fathers, and because, frankly, I have seen too much human suffering to add unnecessarily to the sum total of it in this world." "What kind of help could you possibly offer?" Isabella asked, allowing herself for the first time in 3 days to feel something resembling hope. Dr. Thorne pulled a folded document from his medical bag. "I can offer you this. The Baron's medical journal, in which I have made certain editorial adjustments. The entries regarding Ashford Hall and your mother now indicate that Charles Blackwood was suffering from tertiary syphilis during that period, which often causes vivid hallucinations and false memories. His deathbed confession, therefore, can be dismissed as the tragic delusions of a diseased mind. It is not uncommon. I have witnessed it many times." He set the journal on the table between them. "This narrative, supported by my professional authority, will cast doubt on everything the Baron said. It will not erase what people heard, but it will provide reasonable cover for those who wish to believe the more comfortable lie." Isabella picked up the journal with trembling hands, scanning the altered entries. The handwriting was perfect, the medical terminology convincing, the dates strategically chosen. It was, she recognized, both an act of profound compassion and a crime that could see Dr. Thorne struck from the medical register if discovered. "Why risk this?" she asked again, needing to understand. The doctor stood, collecting his bag. 20 years ago, I had a daughter. She fell in love with a young man of good character but unfortunate birth, the illegitimate son of a local landowner. When the Affair was discovered. Her mother's family had her committed to an asylum to avoid the scandal. She died there of despair within 6 months. She was 19 years old. His voice remained steady, but his eyes glistened with old grief. I could not save her because I was too bound by propriety and fear, but I can save your daughters, Lady Blackwood, and I intend to do so. That evening, Isabella summoned the household staff to the main hall. Jonathan, still locked in his private torment, did not attend. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, dressed in her finest black morning gown, every inch the aristocratic lady of the manor despite the storm raging in her heart. "You have all heard rumors," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the vaulted space. "Regarding the Baron's final words, I am here to address them directly, because I will not have this household poisoned by speculation and gossip." She paused, letting the silence build. "The Baron, in his final delirium, made certain claims about my parentage. Dr. Thorne has confirmed what I suspected, that my late father-in-law was suffering from advanced syphilitic disease, which caused severe mental deterioration and hallucinations in his final months. The accusations he made were the product of a diseased mind, nothing more. They are as false as they are painful to hear spoken against my late parents, the Viscount and Viscountess Ashford, who cannot defend themselves from slander. I will not dignify these delusions with further discussion." Isabella let her gaze sweep across the assembled servants, making eye contact with each in turn, using every ounce of aristocratic authority she possessed. "However, I am aware that certain members of this household have been spreading these falsehoods as though they were truth. This ends now. Any servant found repeating the Baron's deathbed ravings will be dismissed immediately, without reference, and I will ensure that no respectable household in England will employ you again." The threat was clear, backed by the full power of her class position. Most of the servants nodded their understanding, properly cowed. But Mrs. Hartwell, standing at the back of the group, simply smiled. And Isabella knew, with the cold certainty of a chess player recognizing checkmate 3 moves ahead, that the housekeeper would not be silenced by threats or money or even the doctor's falsified records. Agnes Hartwell wanted blood. She wanted revenge for 40 years of perceived slights and unrecognized service, and she had the weapon to take it, the truth, or at least a truth close enough to destroy the Blackwood family utterly. Something would have to be done about Mrs. Hartwell, something permanent. The thought crystallized in Isabella's mind with startling clarity, and she was not horrified by it. She was simply practical. The Baron's funeral took place on a grey November morning, attended by 200 members of the county's finest families, all dressed in their mourning blacks and silently cataloguing every detail for later discussion. Isabella stood beside Jonathan at the graveside, her veil hiding her face, her gloved hand resting lightly on her husband's arm in a performance of wifely devotion that deserved an award from the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. Jonathan trembled throughout the service, whether from grief or horror or the after-effects of his brandy consumption, she could not say and no longer cared. What mattered was the appearance. What mattered was that when these 200 gossips returned to their estates and townhouses, they carried with them the image of a united, grieving family, not the reality of a marriage built unknowingly on incest and now collapsing into madness. Father Michael O'Brien delivered the eulogy, his voice heavy with the weight of secrets heard in confession. He spoke of the Baron's military service, his stewardship of the estate, his devotion to his son. He did not mention hallucinations or syphilis or deathbed confessions, but Isabella noticed how his eyes avoided hers throughout the service, how his hand shook slightly as he blessed the coffin. The priest knew. Dr. Thorne's falsified journal might convince society, but it would not convince a man of God who had heard Isabella's tearful confession and understood exactly what sins, witting or unwitting, had been committed. She would need to speak with Father O'Brien soon before his conscience overcame his vows of confidentiality. Mrs. Hartwell attended the funeral, of course, dressed in the severe black of senior household staff, standing with the other servants at a respectful distance from the family plot. But Isabella felt the woman's eyes on her throughout the ceremony, measuring, calculating, waiting. After the service, as the mourners filed back toward the manor for the funeral breakfast, Isabella watched the housekeeper intercept Lord Edmund Ashcroft, a notorious gossip and publisher of a London scandal sheet that operated under the thin disguise of a society newspaper. They spoke for perhaps 3 minutes, Mrs. Hartwell's lips moving rapidly, while Lord Ashcroft's eyebrows rose higher and higher. He glanced toward Isabella, then back to the housekeeper, then pulled a calling card from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. Isabella felt her blood turn to ice water. Lord Ashcroft would pay handsomely for this story. Within a week, the scandal would be in print. Within 2 weeks, it would be discussed in every drawing room and gentlemen's club in London. Within a month, Charlotte and Eleanor would be permanently unmarriageable, their futures destroyed before they learned to write their own names. Dr. Thorne's falsified journal would be dismissed as exactly what it was, a transparent attempt to cover the truth. And Jonathan, in his current state of religious mania and self-loathing, would likely confess everything himself, seeking some twisted form of divine absolution through public humiliation. That night, Isabella sat in her private sitting room with Dr. Thorne, discussing options in low voices while rain hammered against the windows. "Mrs. Hartwell has made contact with Lord Ashcroft," Isabella reported, her hands folded calmly in her lap, despite the hurricane of emotions within. "She will sell her story within days. We are out of time." The doctor removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes wearily. "I had hoped she would accept the financial settlement. You offered and simply leave. I see now that was naive. She wants more than money. She wants to see you suffer." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Lady Blackwood, there are certain medical compounds that, administered properly, can simulate natural death. Heart failure, particularly in women of Mrs. Hartwell's age and constitution, is unfortunately common and rarely investigated." The suggestion hung between them, unadorned and terrible. Isabella had been raised to faint at the sight of blood, to require smelling salts during difficult conversations, to embody Victorian feminine fragility in all its performative glory. But her mother had also taught her in those whispered afternoon conversations that women survived by doing what men would not admit was necessary, that respectability was a luxury purchased with blood, and that the greatest crime was not the killing, but the getting caught. "Digitalis," Isabella asked quietly, naming the heart medication that, in excess, became poison. Dr. Thorne nodded slowly. "A somewhat larger dose than prescribed, mixed into evening tea, painless, quick, indistinguishable from natural cardiac arrest in a woman of her years." "And you would assist in this?" Isabella needed absolute clarity. This was not a conversation that allowed for misunderstanding. The doctor met her eyes steadily. "I would prepare the medication. I would sign the death certificate. I would ensure that no autopsy was performed and that the body was buried quickly, as is proper in cases of sudden death. Beyond that, how the medication comes to be administered would be a matter I need not inquire about too closely." He stood, collecting his bag. "I should mention that Mrs. Hartwell has been complaining of heart palpitations recently. She consulted me just last week, in fact. I prescribed Digitalis, a perfectly standard treatment. If she were to accidentally take too much of her prescribed medication, well, such tragedies do occur with elderly patients who become confused about dosages." Isabella rose as well, understanding that the decision was hers alone to make. Dr. Thorne was offering her the means and the cover, but he could not commit the act himself. That burden would rest on her conscience, assuming she still possessed one after everything that had happened. "When would you need to know my decision?" she asked. "Soon," he replied gently. "Lord Ashcroft's newspaper goes to press on Friday. Today is Tuesday. If Mrs. Hartwell is to suffer an unfortunate cardiac event, it would need to be within the next 48 hours to prevent publication." He placed a small brown bottle on the table beside her. "This is digitalis in concentrated form. 10 drops in a cup of tea would be therapeutic. 30 drops would be fatal within an hour. I will leave it here, in case you have need of it for your own heart palpitations. You have been under tremendous strain, after all." After Dr. Thorne departed, Isabella sat alone in the darkness, the bottle of digitalis cold in her palm. Was she truly contemplating murder? The word seemed so harsh, so criminal, when applied to what was really an act of maternal protection. Mrs. Hartwell was not an innocent. She was actively working to destroy 2 baby girls who had done nothing wrong, who existed only because adults had made terrible mistakes. In the calculus of morality, did Charlotte and Eleanor's futures not outweigh one bitter old woman's desire for revenge? The Catholic faith would say no. Murder was murder, regardless of motive. But Isabella was discovering that faith was a luxury of those whose children were safe. She thought of her mother, Margaret Ashford, who had carried the secret of Isabella's true parentage to her grave. Had Margaret felt this same cold calculation? Had she weighed the cost of truth against the cost of silence and chosen silence because it protected her daughter? Isabella would never know, but she understood now, in a way she never had before, why her mother had whispered those lessons about survival and ruthlessness during their walks. Margaret had been preparing her daughter for exactly this moment, the moment when a woman must decide whether to be good or to be effective, knowing she cannot be both. The following evening, Isabella carried a tea tray to Mrs. Hartwell's rooms above the stables herself, dismissing the kitchen maid who normally performed such tasks. The housekeeper looked up from her, packing with undisguised surprise as Lady Blackwood entered, bearing servant's work like a common housemaid. "I have come to apologize," Isabella said quietly, setting the tray on the small table near the window. "I have been unjust to you, Mrs. Hartwell. You have served this family faithfully for 40 years, and I responded to your loyalty with threats and accusations. It was beneath me." She poured the tea with steady hands, adding precisely the amount of milk and sugar she knew the housekeeper preferred. 30 drops of concentrated digitalis dissolved invisibly into the steaming liquid. Mrs. Hartwell's suspicious expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained calculating. "Well, your ladyship, I confess I did not expect such humility from you. Perhaps there is more of your mother in you than I credited." The barb about Margaret Ashford's adultery was intentional, but Isabella merely smiled and gestured to the tea. "Please, drink while it is hot. I have also brought some of Cook's ginger biscuits, which I know you favor." She settled into the chair across from the housekeeper, her own cup untouched before her, watching as Agnes Hartwell lifted the poisoned tea to her lips. For a moment, Isabella felt a wave of revulsion so powerful she nearly knocked the cup from the woman's hands. But then she thought of Charlotte's innocent smile, of Eleanor's baby laughter, of the life they would lead if this secret became public knowledge. Mrs. Hartwell drank, deeply, sighing with satisfaction at the warmth. "It is good tea," she admitted grudgingly. "Perhaps we can come to some arrangement after all, your ladyship. I am not an unreasonable woman. A proper pension, a cottage somewhere quiet, and a guarantee that certain stories remain untold. That seems a fair exchange for my continued silence, does it not?" She was negotiating her price even as the poison began its work in her bloodstream. Isabella felt nothing, not guilt, not triumph, not even relief, just a cold, practical satisfaction that she had done what needed doing. "I think that sounds very reasonable," Isabella replied evenly. "We can discuss the details in the morning, when you are rested." 20 minutes later, Mrs. Hartwell complained of feeling unwell. Her hand went to her chest, her breathing became labored, and the teacup slipped from her fingers to shatter on the floor. Isabella, playing her role with perfect conviction, rushed to support the collapsing woman, crying out for help in tones of appropriate alarm. The stable boys came running, then the footman, then finally Dr. Thorne, who had been conveniently dining at Thornfield Park that evening. He examined Mrs. Hartwell with professional thoroughness, while Isabella wrung her hands and explained tearfully that she had brought tea to apologize for their earlier disagreement, that the housekeeper had seemed perfectly well, that this sudden attack had come without warning. Dr. Thorne pronounced Mrs. Agnes Hartwell dead of cardiac arrest at 9:47 in the evening, November 15th, 1878. He noted for the record that the deceased had been under his care for heart palpitations and had been prescribed digitalis, which she kept in her rooms. It appeared she had perhaps taken her medication incorrectly, though of course at her age, sudden heart failure was not uncommon even without pharmaceutical complications. An autopsy would be unnecessary, particularly given the family's recent bereavement. The body would be prepared for burial in the village churchyard within 2 days. It was all very tragic, very sudden, and, most importantly, very final. Isabella attended Mrs. Hartwell's funeral with appropriate solemnity, placing a wreath of white lilies on the grave and speaking kindly of the housekeeper's years of service. Lord Ashcroft, deprived of his scandal and his source, returned to London empty-handed. The other servants, properly cowed by the dual deaths and Isabella's demonstrations of both generosity and ruthlessness, kept their mouths shut. Dr. Thorne's falsified journal, combined with Mrs. Hartwell's convenient demise, effectively buried the Baron's confession under layers of plausible doubt. Those who had heard the deathbed revelation began to question their own memories. Perhaps the old man had been raving. Perhaps they had misunderstood. Perhaps it was kinder and safer to believe the comfortable lie than to investigate the uncomfortable truth. But Jonathan was unraveling. The brandy consumption increased. His religious obsessions deepened into full mania. He spent hours in the chapel, praying loudly for purification and forgiveness, his voice echoing through Thornfield Park like the cries of a damned soul. He began to see signs and portents everywhere. A dead bird on the doorstep meant God's judgment. A broken mirror foretold damnation. His daughter's innocent laughter became the cackling of demons. Isabella watched her husband's descent into madness with a mixture of pity and practical concern. A mad aristocrat was a dangerous aristocrat. Madness made men unpredictable, and unpredictability could destroy everything she had killed to protect. In that moment, she understood that destiny was not something to be accepted, but something to be confronted. Stories like this remind us of the strength that arises from injustice. If you believe in the power of second chances and wish to see more of these forbidden chronicles, we invite you to subscribe to the channel so these tales can continue to be told. For Isabella's journey was far from over, and the greatest test of her resolve was yet to come. Father O'Brien came to Thornfield Park on a cold December morning, his face grave with purpose. He found Isabella in the music room, where she sat at the pianoforte without playing, simply staring at the ivory keys as though they might provide answers to questions she no longer dared to ask aloud. Lady Blackwood, the priest, began without preamble. "I cannot remain silent any longer. What you confess to me, the nature of your marriage, cannot be absolved while you continue to live as man and wife. The Church's position is clear. You must separate from Lord Jonathan immediately and permanently. Your marriage was never valid in the eyes of God. To continue in it is to persist in mortal sin." Isabella turned on the piano bench to face him, her expression unreadable. "And my daughters, Father? What becomes of them when the Church declares my marriage invalid? They become bastards. Worse than bastards, they become the children of incest, unable to inherit, unable to marry, unable to exist in decent society. Is that the Christian charity you preach?" Father O'Brien's face reddened, but his voice remained firm. "I preach God's law, Lady Blackwood. The children's suffering is tragic, but it does not change the fundamental sin. You cannot build happiness on a foundation of sacrilege." Isabella stood, moving toward him with the same deliberate steps she had used with Mrs. Hartwell. "Then I will build happiness on whatever foundation I must, Father, and if that places me beyond the reach of God's grace, so be it. My daughters matter more to me than my immortal soul." The priest recoiled as though she had struck him. "You would choose damnation over obedience to God's commandments." Isabella smiled, and it was the saddest expression Father O'Brien had ever witnessed on a human face. "I would choose my children over anything, Father, over God, over salvation, over every promise of heaven your Church offers. If that makes me a monster, then I am a monster. But I am a monster who loves her daughters more than she fears hell." She moved to the door and opened it, a clear dismissal. "I thank you for your concern for my immortal soul, but unless you intend to report what you heard in confession, which would violate your sacred vows, I suggest you leave my household and trouble me no more with talk of sin and separation." Father O'Brien left Thornfield Park that morning and never returned. Isabella learned later that he had requested a transfer to a remote parish in Scotland, citing personal reasons. She suspected the good father could not bear the weight of knowing what she had confessed, knowing what she had likely done to Mrs. Hartwell, and being unable to act on that knowledge without violating the sanctity of the confessional. It was, she reflected, a particular kind of torture reserved for men of conscience trapped by their own principles. She did not feel sorry for him. She had no sympathy left to spare for anyone but her daughters. Jonathan's condition worsened as winter deepened. He stopped eating properly, surviving on communion wafers stolen from the chapel and whatever brandy he could obtain from the wine cellar before Isabella had the butler lock it. His skin took on a greyish pallor, his eyes sank into shadowed hollows, and his hair, once thick and dark, began to fall out in clumps. Dr. Thorne diagnosed nervous exhaustion and prescribed laudanum for sleep, but Jonathan refused all medication, claiming it was the devil's tool to cloud his judgment and prevent him from completing God's work. When pressed about what that work might be, he would only mutter about purification and sacrifice and the sins of the fathers being visited upon the children. Isabella began to fear what that might mean. She instructed Miss Pemberton, the children's nurse, to keep the nursery door locked at all times and to admit no one, not even Lord Jonathan, without Lady Blackwood's explicit permission. The nurse, a sensible woman in her 40s who had witnessed Jonathan's deterioration with growing alarm, agreed readily. But locks could be picked, and determined madmen were notoriously resourceful when their delusions demanded action. Isabella took to sleeping in a chair outside the nursery door, a practice that scandalized the remaining servants, but which she maintained. Nonetheless, she had not saved her daughters from social ruin, only to lose them to their father's religious mania. The breaking point came on a frozen November night, 3 weeks after Mrs. Hartwell's death. Isabella woke from an uneasy doze in her chair to find the nursery door standing open, the lock expertly picked, and Jonathan inside, standing over Charlotte's bed with a pillow clutched in his trembling hands. The child slept peacefully, unaware that her father stood poised to smother her. Eleanor slumbered in her cradle nearby, equally vulnerable, and Jonathan, his face twisted with tears and conviction, whispered prayers of deliverance as he slowly lowered the pillow toward his daughter's face. "Forgive me, Father, for they know not what they are," he murmured. "Accept this sacrifice as proof of my repentance." Isabella moved with a speed born of pure terror. She crossed the nursery in 3 strides and seized Jonathan's arm, wrenching it backward with strength she did not know. She possessed. The pillow fell harmlessly to the floor. Charlotte stirred, but did not wake. Jonathan turned to face his wife, and in his eyes she saw not her husband, but a stranger entirely, a hollow-eyed zealot who believed he was acting in service to a higher power. "They must be cleansed," he said reasonably, as though explaining something obvious to a slow child. "The blood is tainted. Only death can purify them now. Surely you see that, Isabella. Surely you understand." She understood only that the man she had loved was gone, replaced by this monstrous parody of faith. "Get out!" she commanded, her voice low and deadly. "Get out of this room, Jonathan, or I swear before whatever God may be listening that I will kill you where you stand." He laughed, a broken sound like shattering glass. "You cannot kill what is already dead, sister wife. We died the moment Father spoke the truth. We are ghosts pretending to be living, and ghosts cannot murder ghosts." But he left the nursery. Nonetheless, shuffling down the hallway like an ancient man, muttering prayers and prophecies, Isabella locked the door behind him with shaking hands, then gathered both sleeping daughters into her arms and held them close, breathing in their innocent child scent and making silent promises that she would keep them safe, no matter the cost. The next morning, she met with Dr. Thorne in his private consulting room in the village. "He tried to kill them," she reported without preamble. "Last night, he broke into the nursery and attempted to smother Charlotte. He believes God wants him to sacrifice our daughters to atone for our sin." The doctor's face paled. "Dear God, I knew his mental state was precarious, but I did not realize he had progressed to actual danger." He drummed his fingers on his desk, considering options. "We could have him committed to an asylum. I could certify him as dangerously insane, but such a commitment would require public hearings, medical examinations by other physicians, and a formal legal process. The scandal would be unavoidable." "Is there another option?" Isabella asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Dr. Thorne met her eyes steadily, and in that exchange of glances, they both understood what was being proposed without words. "Laudanum overdoses are tragically common among men suffering from severe melancholia and nervous disorders," the doctor said carefully. "A man in Lord Jonathan's condition, drinking heavily, taking laudanum for sleep, distraught over his father's death, it would not be shocking if he accidentally took too much. Or perhaps not so accidentally, if you take my meaning. Suicide among the aristocracy is more common than society cares to admit. We simply call it accidental death to spare the family embarrassment." Isabella thought of the man Jonathan had been, kind, educated, loving. Then she thought of the man he had become, dangerous, delusional, homicidal. And she thought of Charlotte and Eleanor, innocent and unaware of the mortal danger their father posed to them. The choice, when framed in those terms, was not really a choice at all. It was simple mathematics. 1 life against 2. A man already lost to madness against children who still had futures to live. "How much laudanum would be required?" she asked quietly. Dr. Thorne told her. And Isabella, who had already crossed the line from victim to murderer once, found that crossing it a second time was considerably easier than the first. Parágrafo atual, 51 de 65. Faltam 14 parágrafos para concluir. That night, Isabella prepared Jonathan's evening brandy herself, mixing it with a careful measure of laudanum, far more than any physician would prescribe, but not so much that it would appear obviously intentional. She carried the glass to the library, where he had taken up permanent residence, sleeping in the leather armchair by the fire when he slept at all. He looked up when she entered, his eyes briefly clearing with something that might have been recognition. "Isabella," he said softly, and for a moment he sounded like the man who had courted her in Hampshire Gardens, who had written her terrible poetry, who had made her laugh. "I am so very tired." "I know," she replied, and meant it. She handed him the glass. "Drink this. It will help you sleep." He took it without question, trusting her even now, even after everything. Perhaps some part of him understood what she was doing and welcomed it. Perhaps he was too far gone in his madness to care. He drank deeply, draining the glass, then set it aside and leaned back in the chair. "Will God forgive us, do you think?" he asked, his words already beginning to slur as the laudanum took effect. "For what we did, unknowing as it was." Isabella knelt beside his chair and took his hand, the hand that had tried to murder their daughter just hours before. "I do not know," she answered honestly. "But if he does not, then he is not the merciful God the priests claim him to be." Jonathan's eyes fluttered closed. His breathing became deep and regular, then slower still. Isabella sat with him through the night, watching as the man she had loved, the man who had loved her, slipped away into a sleep from which he would never wake. When the morning light filtered through the library windows, she checked for a pulse and found none. Lord Jonathan Blackwood, aged 33, had died peacefully in his sleep of an accidental laudanum overdose, a tragic consequence of his grief-stricken state following his father's death. Dr. Thorne would certify it as such. The servants would whisper sympathetically about the tragedy of 2 deaths in one family within a month, and Isabella would play the devastated widow with the same conviction she had brought to every other performance these terrible weeks had demanded. The double funeral, for Jonathan's body was interred in the family crypt beside his father's, drew even larger crowds than the Baron's had. Isabella stood in her black mourning dress, her daughters held by Miss Pemberton at a respectful distance, accepting condolences from aristocrats who had no idea they were offering sympathy to a double murderess. Lord Ashcroft attended, looking disappointed that no further scandal had emerged. The remaining servants wept genuine tears for their master, who, despite his final madness, had been generally kind to those below stairs. And Isabella felt nothing at all, as though the part of her capable of emotion had been surgically removed, along with her capacity for moral hesitation. Dr. Thorne became a frequent visitor to Thornfield Park in the months that followed, ostensibly to ensure that Lady Blackwood was recovering from her double bereavement, but in truth to serve as the guardian and protector she desperately needed. He was, she realized, in love with her, or perhaps in love with the idea of her, the brave mother who had killed to protect her children. She did not love him in return. She was not certain she could love anyone anymore, having discovered that love made people vulnerable, and vulnerability was fatal. But she valued his loyalty and his medical expertise and his willingness to falsify records and sign false certificates. Those qualities were more useful than love. Charlotte grew into a bright, curious child who loved music and horseback riding. Eleanor developed her mother's red hair and a temperament to match, fierce, determined, and utterly fearless. Neither girl remembered their father's final weeks, for which Isabella thanked whatever merciful instinct caused children to forget trauma. They knew only that Papa had been sick and had gone to heaven, and that Mama loved them more than anything in the world. That was enough truth for them. The deeper truths, the incest, the murders, the terrible choices made in darkness, those would remain Isabella's burden alone. Years passed. The scandal faded into rumor, then into vague recollection, then into forgetfulness. Dr. Thorne's falsified journal provided enough reasonable doubt that most of society concluded the Baron's deathbed confession had indeed been the ravings of a syphilitic mind. A few persistent gossips continued to speculate, but without Mrs. Hartwell to fan the flames and without any living witnesses willing to testify, the story died of natural neglect. Isabella never remarried, despite several respectable offers. She claimed her grief was too profound. In truth, she could not bear the thought of ever being vulnerable to a man again, of ever placing her fate or her daughter's fates in masculine hands. Charlotte made her debut at 18 and married a baronet's son, a kind young man who knew nothing of the old scandal and would not have cared if he had. Eleanor, more rebellious, insisted on attending university. A shocking choice for a young lady, but Isabella, who had learned that rules were merely suggestions for those with sufficient will, supported her daughter's unconventional path. Both girls lived long, happy lives, unmarried by the secrets of their conception. They never knew they were the product of incest. They never knew their mother was a murderer. They knew only that they were loved, fiercely and completely, by a woman who had sacrificed everything, including her soul, to give them futures. Isabella Blackwood lived to be 73 years old, the same age as the Baron when he had made his fatal confession. She died peacefully in her sleep at Thornfield Park, surrounded by her daughters, her grandchildren, and Dr. Thorne, who had remained her steadfast companion for 35 years without ever pressing his suit beyond friendship. On her deathbed, when the priest came to offer last rites, she refused confession. "I have no sins to confess that I regret," she told the scandalized clergyman. "I did what any mother would do. If God condemns me for protecting my children, then his heaven holds no interest for me." She died, with those words on her lips, unrepentant and unafraid. The true story of what happened at Thornfield Park in the winter of 1878 died with her. Dr. Thorne burned the falsified medical journal and his private notes before his own death 5 years later. The servants who had witnessed the Baron's confession were long dead or scattered to other households. Their memories faded. Charlotte and Eleanor, grown women with families of their own, knew only the official version, that their grandfather had died of tuberculosis, their father of grief-induced melancholia and accidental overdose, and their mother of old age after a life well lived. The deeper truth, the incest, the murders, the terrible mathematics of maternal love remained buried in the family crypt along with the bodies of those who had known it. But perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Some truths serve no purpose but to wound the innocent. Some sins, committed in darkness to protect light, deserve the mercy of forgetting. Isabella Blackwood was a murderer twice over, a woman who had poisoned one victim and overdosed another without hesitation or remorse. She was also a mother who had saved her daughters from a fate worse than death, the fate of being punished eternally for sins they did not commit. History does not record which of these truths matters more, but her daughters thrived, her grandchildren prospered, and the line she had killed to protect continued for generations, blissfully unaware of the blood price. Their matriarch had paid for their normalcy. Their journey teaches us that even in the deepest shadows, an act of courage can bring light. If you wish for more secrets of the past to be revealed and for justice, even if delayed, to prevail, your subscription to the channel gives us the strength to continue this mission. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Empire's dark secrets. For in the end, Isabella Blackwood proved what desperate mothers have always known, that there is no crime so great that a child's future does not justify it, no sin so terrible that maternal love cannot bear its weight, and no moral law so absolute that it cannot be broken when innocence hangs in the balance. She chose her daughters over God, over law, over her immortal soul. And in doing so she became both monster and saint, condemned by every code of morality Victorian England held sacred, yet vindicated by the simple fact that Charlotte and Eleanor lived, loved, and died without ever knowing they were meant to be society's sacrifices. That was Isabella's revenge against a world that would have destroyed them. And that, perhaps, was justice of a kind that no court could ever adjudicate.